Despite Jungian psychology becoming more and more popular, you may struggle to find accessible information resources which would explain the key concepts of Jungian psychology in a manner that is not totally esoteric. I found that possibly one of the most elusive archetypes that you may struggle to understand, as I did, is the animus. In Jungian psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman's personality. It is the counterpart to the anima, which is the unconscious feminine side of a man's personality. The animus is often associated with qualities such as judgment, reason, logic, objectivity, and sometimes is associated with an assertive and aggressive behavior, but not always. It is a representation of a woman's inner masculine principle, logos, and it can manifest itself in her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. What is rather annoying about the animus is that it does not behave like the anima of a man. It is quite well known that the soul of a man often appears in its personified form. Meanwhile, the spirit of a woman very rarely presents itself in its personified form. One example of the animus that you can find in the culture that is probably already known to you is the Asmodeus, the evil spirit that possessed Sarah in the book of Tobit and killed her 7 husbands before being exorcised by Tobiah. Moreover, when a woman writes about the animus, she may have to consider the fact that the animus itself may have its own views on the matter. Jung noted that while there are many depictions of the anima in films, literature, and art, it is extremely difficult to find a good portrait of the animus, and that is because the animus drives the work of women and often chooses not to reveal itself. In contrast, the anima seems quite open to being portrayed. Importantly, the animus is a figure that is both individual and collective, and so it is particularly well suited to act as a liaison between the unconscious and the conscious. At first, it may seem that the animus is not inclined to play this helpful role, but this really does depend on the individual characteristics. For instance, women with positive relationships with their fathers may have an innate cyclical structure for a positive experience with the animus. However, later on, this may be compensated in their life by dealing with a particularly difficult and unruly animus. It is important to remember that the animus, like the anima, has both positive and negative aspects. One of the most common and least unpleasant ways to learn about the animus is through dreams, where it often does appear personified. The animus can take on many forms, including both positive and negative human, demonic, and divine figures. He can be a priest, a monk, a teacher, or a ruler. It may also appear in dreams as actual men that the dreamer knows, such as husband, father, brother, or lover. The animus can interfere in our relationships. As long as the projection we have for the animus seems like a good fit, we may not be aware of it. But eventually, especially if the relationship is important enough, it can cause a lot of problems. Most women who have experienced the reality of the animus firsthand feel very negative towards it, because it can disrupt our intentions, it can destroy our relationships, and it can replace our sound instincts and feelings with a generic collection of opinions. It prevents us from living our best lives. However, this is only true of the negative animus. Yes, all of these explanations about the animus, they seem fine, but they tell us relatively little about what is it that the animus is, how does it appear, what role does it really play in our lives. It may therefore be better to illustrate the relationship between a woman and her animus using a story, or rather a fairy tale. One of the stories analyzed by Barbara Hanna, a student of Carl Jung, was the Goose Girl, also known as the Never Never Princess. This story was first published in 1815 in a collection of fairy tales by Brothers Grimm. As you're listening to this fairy tale, in its much shortened version, keep in mind that no character in a fairy tale represents only one particular aspect of a person's psyche. Characters are archetypical basic structures of the collective unconscious, and they anticipate in individual characteristics, so it would be too simplistic to directly translate a fairy tale character into a person's unconscious archetype. However, when you hear this story, do pay attention to how characters behave towards one another, which characters are positive, which characters are negative, and how they form relationships with each other. In general, you could say that the princess is the foundation of an ego, while the maid mostly acts as her shadow. Conrad, a boy, represents the animus in its irresponsible negative aspect, and then proceeds to represent a more positive aspect of the animus as the story unfolds. The prince represents the positive animus, while the king represents the animus as a collective ruling principle and wisdom. There was once a queen who had been widowed for many years and had a beautiful daughter. When the princess grew up, she was to marry a prince who lived far away. When it was time for her to marry and leave for the distant kingdom, the old queen packed everything that a royal dowry would include. As she loved her daughter deeply, she also gave the princess a chambermaid to accompany her on the journey. Each of them was given a horse for the trip. The princess's horse was called Falada, and he could speak. When it was time for them to depart, the old queen went into her bedroom and cut her fingers with a small knife until they bled. She then held out a white cloth and let 3 drops of blood fall into it, giving it to her daughter and saying, "Take good care of these, they will be of use to you in your journey." The princess and the maid set off. After riding for a while, the princess became thirsty and asked her chambermaid to dismount, take the cup she had brought, and get her some water from the nearby brook. But the chambermaid replied, "If you are thirsty, get off your horse and drink from the brook yourself. I am not your servant." The same situation repeated again, next time that the princess became thirsty. Having drunk some water, the cloth that was given to the princess by her mother was lost. The maid was delighted, thinking she now had total control over the bride, as the princess had become weak and powerless by losing the drops of blood. When it was time to mount their horses, the chambermaid said, "I'm riding Falada, you can ride my nag," and the princess had to comply. The chambermaid then treated the princess harshly, making her take off her royal clothing and put on her own shabby clothes. Finally, the princess was forced to swear on the open sky that she wouldn't tell anyone at the royal court about this. If she hadn't taken this oath, the chambermaid would have killed her on the spot. Falada saw everything and remembered it well. The chambermaid rode Falada, while the real princess rode the inferior horse, and they continued on their journey until they arrived at the royal palace. It was a great celebration upon their arrival, and the prince ran to meet them, lifting the chambermaid off her horse, thinking she was the bride. The old chambermaid was taken upstairs, while the real princess was left standing in the courtyard. The old king looked out of the window and saw her waiting there, and he asked the false bride about the girl standing in the courtyard, wondering who she was. The bride replied, "I picked her up on my way here as a companion. Give her some work to do so that she doesn't stand around idly." However, the old king had no work for the princess, and he could only say, "I have a young boy who tends to the geese. She can help him." The boy's name was Conrad, and the real princess had to help him tend to the geese. Soon after, the false bride asked the young king to behead the horse she arrived on, Falada. She was afraid that the horse might reveal how she had treated the real princess. As a result, poor Falada was killed. His head was hung over a large dark gateway that led to and out of the castle. When the real princess walked through the gateway the next day, she said, "Alas, Falada, hanging there." Falada's head answered, "Alas, young queen, passing by. If this your mother knew, her heart would break in two." Then Princess and Conrad went further into the countryside, driving their geese into the fields. When they reached the meadow, the princess sat down and let down her hair, which was pure gold. Conrad saw it and was delighted by its shine, trying to pluck out a few hairs. She asked the wind to take away Conrad's hat and make him chase it until she has braided her hair. A strong wind blew up, taking Conrad's hat across the fields. and he had to run after it. While he returned, she had already finished combing and putting up her hair, so he couldn't get a single strand. Conrad became angry and would not speak to her, so they tended to the geese until evening and then went home. This situation repeated over a course of many days. One evening, after they have returned home, Conrad went to the king and said, "I will not tend to the geese with that girl anymore." The king then asked him to explain what is it that the princess had done to him. Conrad said, "In the morning when we passed through the dark gateway with the flock, there is a horse's head on the wall and she speaks to it. She also commands the wind to take away my hut in the pastures." The king ordered him to drive his flock out again the next day, and he followed the princess and Conrad during the day. The king saw all unusual occurrences and then left unseen. When the Goose Girl returned home in the evening, he called her aside and asked why she did all these things. "I am not allowed to tell you, and I cannot reveal my sorrows to anyone, because I swore an oath under an open sky not to do so. If I had not taken the oath, I would have been killed." He pressed her and wouldn't let her rest, but he couldn't get anything out of her. Finally he said, "If you will not tell me anything, then tell your sorrows to the iron stove above." And he left. So she went into the iron stove and began to cry with sorrow, pouring out her heart and explaining her situation. The king was standing outside listening, and he heard what she said. He came back inside and asked her to come out of the stove. Then they dressed her in royal clothes, and she was stunningly beautiful. The king summoned his son and told him that he had had a fake bride who was just a chambermaid, that the true one was standing there, the one who had been a goose girl. The bridegroom sat at the head of a table with the king's daughter on one side and the chambermaid on the other. But the chambermaid was tricked because she did not recognize the princess in her dazzling clothes. After they had eaten and drunk and were in a good mood, the king asked the chambermaid a riddle, telling her the whole story and at the end asking, "What punishment does someone deserve who has deceived their master this way?" The fake bride said, "They deserve no better fate than to be stripped naked and put in a barrel with sharp nails on the inside. 2 white horses should be hitched to it, and they should drag her through one street after another until she's dead." "You are the one," said the king, "and you've pronounced your own sentence. This will be your punishment." After the sentence was carried out, the young king married his true bride, and they both ruled in their kingdom in happiness and peace. Now that you have heard the entire fairy tale of Goose Girl by Grimm Brothers, we can delve deeper into the interpretation of its symbols and themes. Some of these symbols may be surprising, but they offer an important insight into the psychological dynamics at play in this story. By exploring the meaning behind these elements, we can gain a greater understanding of how to address problems with our own psyche. And just like dreams, fairy tales can be interpreted using the same method to uncover the hidden meanings and to gain deeper understanding of ourselves. So let's take a closer look at the journey of the princess as she seeks to discover her true counterpart, the Animus, and she confronts her own shadow. What do these symbols and themes represent in the context of the human psyche, and how do they relate to our own experiences and struggles? How can we use these insights to better understand and integrate the opposing forces within ourselves? In the fairy tale, the princess lived at the court of the queen. This represents the realm of Eros, the feminine principle of relatedness. There seems to be barely any trace of a male presence, and the only embodiment of the main principle of Logos seems to be Falada, the talking horse, who also at this stage symbolizes the princess's inner instinct. As the princess embarks on her journey to discover her true counterpart, the Animus, she's accompanied by her maid, who represents the shadow aspect of the princess and initially is in her correct position serving the princess. The journey towards the Animus is really significant for the princess. She will discover her own inner male principle and learn to integrate it into her personality. The protection of the 3 drops of blood given to her by the Queen Mother symbolizes the importance of the feminine principle of life, emotions, and the heart, and it was meant to help to ensure that the princess would be safe on her journey. In this fairy tale, the princess encountered first difficulties when the maid refused to fetch her water. and the princess failed to assert herself, and she did not insist that the maid fulfill her duties. So this moment of confrontation is the princess's first encounter with her shadow, and her decision to fetch the water herself represents her choosing the path of least resistance. However, by failing to attend to these key responsibilities of keeping her maid in her correct position, and by allowing the maid to take on the leading role, the princess soon loses the cloth gifted to her by her mother, which symbolizes her loss of connection with the principles of womanhood. The loss also causes the princess to become dependent on the shadow, and for herself to be reduced to a role of a mere maid rather than the ego or the central consciousness that she had previously represented. In order to survive, the princess is forced to accept her role as a servant and promise to keep this a secret from others, and by this point, she has allowed her shadow to take control because she has neglected her responsibilities. There is no hope of regaining control over the shadow if we refuse to acknowledge what has happened. So the princess is now in a very dangerous situation, as her animus, the prince, and the shadow, the maid, are about to be married, which is the worst possible outcome. Even worse, her own instinct, Falada, will soon be beheaded. In the story, every day, as the princess tends to the geese, Falada reminds her of her true identity as a young queen. He urges her to recognize that her current humble position as the Goose Girl cannot be a final solution to this problem. The princess must not leave the opposite part of herself, her pride and ambition, to be ruled by her shadow. If she does, she risks breaking from the essence of her being and from the feminine principle of Eros. During this dark and difficult period of her life, the princess must attend to the geese. A goose is a well-known symbol of Nemesis, a goddess of fate and revenge, as well as a symbol connected to Baba Yaga. The princess has lost connection with the good queen, the benevolent mother, and so she now has to act as a servant of the negative feminine, of the all-devouring mother, and she has to herd her geese. The act of combing her hair symbolizes the princess organizing her thoughts, which are being pursued by Conrad, a negative and an infantile version of the animus. The princess has already lost to her shadow on the journey to the positive animus, so it is her turn now to deal with the negative aspect represented by Conrad. Through her conversations with Falada, the princess remains connected to nature, just enough so that she is able to ask for assistance of the wind, which represents the spirit, and is able to blow Conrad's away every morning. This serves as an important lesson about dealing with the animus, as the negative and infantile animus represented by Conrad is helpless against the spirit itself. So if we can reach to the depths of our psyche, we will find help that would otherwise be unavailable. If the princess had relied on rational and conscious means, she might have quarreled with Conrad and allowed him to gain control over some of her thoughts. However, arguing directly with the animus is unwise, as he is happy with discord and argument, which can only ultimately result in a feeling of defeat. Instead, it is Conrad himself who ultimately brings the positive animus into play. After the princess stands her ground and refuses to give in to Conrad's childishness, Conrad has no choice but to appeal to higher authority, bringing in the old king into the situation. When the king tests Conrad's statements by concealing himself and following the princess, he asks the Goose Girl, the princess in disguise, to tell him her story. She refuses, showing loyalty to her shadow. This again serves as a valuable lesson about how to deal with the shadow. One cannot simply integrate the shadow by deliberately living its bad qualities. Instead, one must maintain faith to it, as the princess does, by granting the shadow the right to exist and by paying her debt to it. The maid would have had the princess killed, but instead allowed her to live. He persuades the princess to crawl into an iron stove, which represents the mother's womb, or the alchemical stove where transformations occur. So the princess is reborn. Later, when the maid announces the punishment for a disobedient servant, she in fact announces her own punishment. The shadow, in a way, overreaches itself and must submit itself to its own rule. It has to be depotentiated and reduced in its power. As the maid is dragged through the street and reduced to an inanimate shadow, this is a moment that represents transformation rather than actual death, because archetypes such as the shadow cannot be killed. The princess, now the bride, must take on the responsibility for her own identity and not allow her naturally retiring disposition to mislead her into playing only a portion of this role.